What if a single moment on a quiet country road could change the entire direction of a man's life? Ethan was a weary veteran searching for silence and escape until the day his loyal dog Duke pulled him toward an old man lying injured on the roadside. That one decision to stop and help opened the door to hidden truths, a threatened forest, and a new purpose. Ethan never expected. Now enjoy the story. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments below and subscribe. The afternoon sky hung in a pale gold haze, and the breeze drifted softly over the open road, while distant birds traced slow arcs above the rolling hills. The heat of the season lay across the land with a gentle weight that felt neither harsh nor kind, only steady, as if the world itself were catching its breath after a long journey. Ethan Brooks guided his aging pickup along the narrow highway that cut through the outskirts of town. At 40 years old, he carried the appearance of a man shaped by years of dust, sun, and constant labor. His frame was strong and broad-shouldered from his time in the military, and later from the heavy lifting jobs that barely kept food on his table. His jaw had sharp lines and a day-old stubble that never seemed to soften his expression. His eyes were a muted brown, touched with the tiredness of someone who had learned too early that life rarely bent in his direction. The skin along his arms and face held the deep tan of long days under open sky, and the slight creases on his forehead spoke of silent battles he never voiced. Returning from the Middle East, years before, had carved something out of him that he never managed to replace. Civilian life demanded smiles and easy laughter, but Ethan had neither to give. He had tried at first, but the distance between him and the rest of the world grew until even the people he loved could no longer reach him. His marriage had failed not through anger, but through slow erosion. His former wife, Sarah, a slender woman with soft brown hair and gentle gray eyes, had once believed she could wait out the storms within him. She had a quiet temperament and the grace of someone who handled emotions with care, but she carried her own exhaustion. As Ethan drifted deeper into silence and long days spent chasing work, Sarah found herself living beside a shadow rather than a partner. Eventually she left with calm words and a steady expression, taking with her only her books and the small pieces of hope she had once pinned to their future. Ethan did not blame her. In truth, he barely blamed anyone anymore. Now he worked wherever he could find labor, hauling lumber one week and loading crates at a warehouse the next. Each job paid just enough to cover the next overdue bill, but never enough to free him from the cycle. Debt pressed against him like an invisible hand on his back. The house he once owned had been sold long ago, and the few possessions he kept filled the back seat of the pickup. That pickup groaned now beneath the weight of age as he steered it away from town, its engine rattling with the stubborn pride of a machine long past its best years. Beside him sat Duke, his German shepherd, and the one steady presence in his fractured life. Duke was 6 years old, with a thick coat of sable and black fur that shone under the afternoon sun. His posture was strong and alert, his ears always attentive to the smallest shift in sound. His amber eyes held a keen intelligence and a loyalty that Ethan felt he had not earned. Duke had been trained for obedience and agility back when Ethan still believed structure and purpose could fix the holes inside him. When the world around Ethan changed, Duke simply stayed. There was a gentleness in the way the dog rested his head against Ethan's arm, and a confidence in the way he watched the road ahead, as though he expected nothing more in return than the space to exist beside the man who had become his whole world. Ethan exhaled slowly as the last houses of the town disappeared behind him. He was not running away, not exactly, but he was stepping out of a life that had worn holes into his spirit. The town reminded him of bills unpaid, conversations left unfinished, and the heavy silence that had settled inside his chest for years. He longed for a kind of quiet that healed instead of hurt, for a place where he could let the weight of everything slip off his shoulders, even if only for a short time. His plan was simple. He would head toward the edge of the forest, where an old dirt road led into acres of untended land. There he could find a patch of shade, pitch a temporary shelter, and breathe without feeling watched or judged. He did not know how long he would stay. He only knew he needed distance from the noise of the world. He needed a space where the past could not reach him quite so easily. The road narrowed into a winding curve, bordered by grass and low shrubs. Duke raised his head and pressed his muzzle against the open window, letting the wind ruffle his fur. Ethan felt something loosen within him at the sight. Duke had a way of reminding him that life existed moment by moment and not as a single, immovable burden. Ethan wished he could see things that simply. He thought about the years after his deployment. He remembered standing in crowded stores where the noise pressed painfully against him. He remembered lying awake at night, staring at the ceiling as memories of explosions and dust storms flickered behind his eyes. He never spoke about those memories. They were carved into him too deeply for words. Instead, he worked until exhaustion, avoided gatherings, and stayed close to Duke, who never demanded explanations. As the pickup turned onto the dirt path, the landscape opened into a broad stretch of forest ahead. Sunlight filtered through the tall pines scattered across the hills, and the air carried the earthy scent of soil warmed by the afternoon heat. The land looked worn, but peaceful, almost inviting. Ethan felt something subtle shift in his chest, a feeling close to relief, though he did not trust it fully. He parked near a patch of open grass and turned off the engine. The sudden quiet enveloped him. Duke jumped out first and trotted ahead, his gait confident and purposeful. Ethan followed slowly, taking in the rough beauty of the land. He imagined building a small temporary space here, nothing permanent, just enough shelter to keep the sun off and give him time to think. The thought did not excite him, but it felt manageable, and manageable was all he needed right now. He walked a few steps farther and paused. The silence around him was unlike the silence inside him. This silence was natural, filled with distant bird calls and leaves rustling high above. It did not press or accuse. It simply existed and allowed him the choice to move or stand still. Ethan realized how long it had been since he had felt such quiet. Duke circled back to him and nudged his leg with a soft whine. Ethan crouched to rub the dog's fur, feeling the warmth beneath his palm. "You like it here," he murmured, without thinking, though no special symbols were used. The dog lifted his head and pressed closer, as if saying that whatever came next, they would face it together. Ethan looked at the horizon through the thin veil of golden sunlight and allowed himself one steady breath. He had come here to step away from the weight of his old life. He did not know what he would find in the forest or how long he would stay. But for the first time in months, he felt a faint spark of possibility. Not hope exactly, but the sense that perhaps the world was not entirely closed against him. He stood again and watched Duke explore the edge of the clearing. The pickup stood behind them, silent and tired, but loyal. The road ahead was uncertain, yet free of demands. Ethan gathered his thoughts and let the quiet of the forest settle around him. He was not healed, he was not whole, but he had taken a step away from the noise, and that felt like something close to beginning again. And so the man and his dog remained at the edge of the forest, preparing to set up a temporary shelter in search of a small haven far from the harshness of their past life. The fading sunlight washed over them, and the land around them carried a calm that neither had felt in a very long time. The midday sun settled heavily over the forest road, casting warm light across the dusty path, while the leaves moved gently in a slow breeze. The air carried the scent of dry grass and distant pine, and the quiet rhythm of summer surrounded the narrow trail where Ethan Brooks guided his old pickup along the uneven ground. Ethan felt the heat pressing against the back of his neck as he drove. His thoughts drifted between fragments of his past and the uncertain direction of his future. The quiet he had hoped to find in the forest had eased some of the tension inside him, but that ease was thin and fragile. He still carried a dull heaviness in his chest that rose and fell with every mile. Duke lay in the passenger seat with his head lifted toward the open window. The warm breeze ruffled his sable and black coat, and his ears twitched at the faint rustle of birds in the trees. At 6 years old, he looked powerful, yet composed, with muscular shoulders and strong paws that spoke of careful breeding and loyal companionship. His amber eyes remained alert, taking in every movement of the world beyond the road. Ethan eased the truck around a bend, where sunlight spilled through the branches above like a soft curtain. He planned to gather some fallen wood for a temporary shelter and maybe scout a small clearing farther ahead. For a brief moment, he imagined he and Duke might finally have found a place quiet enough for both of them to breathe. But Duke suddenly lifted his head higher and let out a low, tense sound. Before Ethan could fully react, Duke sprang from the seat and barked toward the right side of the forest line. Ethan felt a jolt of adrenaline as the dog leapt out the open door the moment the truck rolled to a stop. Duke sprinted down the slope beside the road, while releasing sharp, urgent barks that cut through the still air. Ethan stepped out quickly. His boots scraped against dry gravel as he followed Duke. A familiar shift occurred within him, a focused clarity he had learned in the military. Something was wrong ahead. Duke rarely reacted without purpose. Ethan hurried down the grassy embankment and pushed through a patch of low brush. There on the uneven ground lay an older man. He appeared to be in his late 60s, with thinning gray hair matted to his forehead, and a sturdy but aging frame dressed in worn work clothes. His face held deep lines carved by years of labor and sun exposure. His skin was fair but weathered, and his jaw was square, though partly softened by age. A pair of work gloves lay near his hand, and a small wooden toolbox rested a short distance away, half open. Ethan recognized the type of man who spent a lifetime shaping wood and fixing what others discarded. The man groaned faintly. Ethan knelt beside him. He checked his pulse and noted the pale tone of his skin and the faint sweat across his brow. The man had taken a hard fall, and his left arm bent at an unnatural angle. Ethan saw minor abrasions on his forehead and a shallow but steady breathing pattern. Duke circled close, but kept a respectful distance as if understanding the fragility of the moment. Ethan addressed the man with a calm, steady voice, though without using any special symbols that might disrupt an audio reader. He examined him for additional injuries. The training he had learned overseas settled into place like an old instinct. The man had likely experienced a drop in blood pressure, then fallen hard against the rocks and grass. Ethan tore a strip of cloth from his own shirt sleeve to press against the small wound above the man's eyebrow. He then stabilized the broken arm using a straight piece of fallen branch and a second strip of fabric, working with practiced precision. The man stirred again, his eyes fluttering open. They were a deep hazel color, soft, but clouded with pain and fatigue. Ethan noted a quiet gentleness in them, a look shaped by years of craftsmanship and solitude. The man attempted to speak, but his voice cracked and faded. Ethan reassured him in a low tone, though again, without using quotes. He kept the man still and monitored his breathing. He judged the fall had been recent, but without immediate help, the situation could worsen. Duke seemed to understand completely. Without hesitation, the dog bolted up the slope toward the main road. Ethan watched him run with purpose and felt a wave of gratitude and reliance he had felt many times before. Minutes stretched slowly while Ethan stayed beside the injured man. The forest buzzed with cicadas, and the scent of sun-warmed grass intensified. Ethan felt the pressure of responsibility settle over him, not as a burden, but as a calling he had not felt in years. He stayed alert, listening for signs of help while keeping the man conscious by asking simple questions about his breathing and comfort. Soon, Ethan heard distant voices and the crunch of tires over gravel. Duke had done exactly what was needed. The dog led two passers-by from the main road straight to the scene. One was a middle-aged woman, and the other a younger man, both dressed in casual outdoor clothing. They carried concerned expressions and moved quickly to assist. They had spotted Duke barking at the roadside and followed him without hesitation. With additional hands available, they prepared to lift the injured man carefully up the embankment. Ethan directed them calmly, guiding each movement to minimize further harm. Together, they carried him toward the open back seat of the truck, since it offered more space and cushioning than the small cars the others drove. The man grimaced in pain, but remained conscious. Once they had him settled, the middle-aged woman offered water, and the younger man contacted emergency services. Ethan sat beside the injured man, monitoring his condition. Duke rested near the open door, with his ears alert and chest rising steadily. The dog looked ready to act again if needed. As the minutes passed, the injured man focused on Ethan with clearer awareness. His gaze held a mixture of gratitude and disbelief that someone had appeared at the right moment. His breath steadied, and he managed to speak in a faint voice without symbols or quotes. He told Ethan that his name was Henry Lawson. He explained haltingly that he was a carpenter who often walked this road to gather specific branches and inspect certain trees useful for small craft work. He had felt dizzy and lost his balance before he could reach safety. Ethan studied him with a quiet respect. Henry Lawson carried the look of a man who had spent his life building things with patience and steady hands. His skin bore the marks of long hours in workshops and outdoors. His eyes, although clouded with pain, revealed a depth of kindness and humility. Ethan sensed that Henry was someone who tried to do more for others than for himself, a trait that often shaped men of his generation. When the ambulance arrived and the paramedics transferred Henry from the truck to the stretcher, Henry looked directly at Ethan. His voice was raspy, but firm enough to convey the weight of his words even without quotation marks. He told Ethan that he was alive because of him. The sincerity in Henry's expression struck Ethan in a place he had long believed numb. For a brief moment, Ethan felt something stir inside him, a faint recognition that his presence in this forest road was not simply coincidence. As the paramedics prepared to leave, Ethan stepped back with Duke at his side. The warm summer air settled around them, and the scent of dust rose with the movement of the ambulance tires. Ethan watched it disappear down the road until the sound faded completely. Standing there, Ethan realized that he had not expected his retreat into the woods to involve anyone else yet. Within a single hour, he had crossed the path of someone whose life now touched his own. Duke nudged his leg with a gentle confidence that grounded him. Ethan placed a hand on the dog's head and let out a slow, deliberate breath. He had helped a stranger survive, and in doing so, felt a shift within himself that he could not yet name. The day that began as an escape had suddenly become the beginning of something larger. For now, Ethan only knew that a man named Henry Lawson was alive, and that Duke had once again proven to be more than a companion. He had been a guide directing Ethan toward a new path that neither of them had anticipated. The morning sky was soft and pale, with thin clouds drifting lazily above the treetops, while a gentle warmth settled over the forest. The air carried the earthy scent of damp soil from a light rain the night before, and a mild breeze moved through the leaves with an easy quiet. It was a peaceful beginning to a day that Ethan Brooks knew would bring change, even if he could not yet name what that change might be. Several days had passed since the moment he and Duke had found Henry Lawson lying injured beside the forest road. Ethan thought often about that encounter. He remembered the frailty in Henry's breathing and the quiet strength in his eyes as he thanked Ethan for saving his life. The memory stayed with him in a way he had not expected. It stirred something in him that felt strangely grounding, as if helping Henry had been an anchor thrown toward a direction he had lost long ago. Ethan now stood outside a small clinic on the edge of town. A mix of gravel and dry grass stretched beneath his boots, while Duke waited loyally beside him. The dog sat tall, with his ears relaxed but attentive, his coat catching the soft morning light. Duke looked peaceful, yet excited in a subtle way, his tail sweeping once against the ground as if sensing purpose in their visit. Ethan took a slow breath before stepping inside. The clinic smelled faintly of antiseptic and old wood. He followed the hallway to a modest room where Henry Lawson rested on a narrow bed. Henry's appearance had improved since the rescue, but he still carried the pale tiredness of someone recovering from a painful fall. His arm was wrapped neatly in a cast, and his forehead showed a faint healed mark where Ethan had pressed cloth to stop the bleeding. Yet his hazel eyes were calm and steady, the eyes of a man who had worked with his hands all his life and understood hardship without needing to speak of it. Henry greeted Ethan with a small smile. He sat upright with dignity, despite the strain in his body. His posture revealed a quiet resilience. Years of woodworking had given him broad shoulders and hands shaped by calluses and careful craft. Though age had softened parts of him, the core of his character remained strong. Ethan approached the bed with a reserved nod, unsure of what Henry wanted to discuss. He assumed it might be a simple thank you, or perhaps a brief farewell. Yet something about Henry's expression told him that the conversation would be more meaningful. Henry gestured for him to sit in the wooden chair beside the bed. Duke lay down quietly near the door, head held high and attentive. The dog seemed to sense that this meeting was not an ordinary one. Henry took a steady breath before speaking. His voice was weakened, but carried warmth and a sincerity that felt almost heavy. He told Ethan that he lived alone on a piece of land deeper in the forest. He explained that many years ago he had built a small wooden cabin there, using timber he cut and carved himself. He spoke of it with a mixture of pride and sadness. Over time, age had slowed his strength, and the cabin had grown soft and fragile. The roof, once sturdy, now sagged. The porch steps were uneven. The wood had darkened from weather and neglect. Henry admitted that he no longer had the health to visit the cabin regularly, let alone repair it. He worried that if it remained unattended, the structure would eventually collapse. More importantly, the cabin held memories that mattered deeply to him. It had once been a place of quiet thought, and the center of his small life, when his hands were still capable of long days of labor. Letting it rot away felt like losing a part of himself. Henry looked at Ethan with a mixture of hope and humility. He told him that after what had happened on the road, he believed Ethan was someone he could trust. He asked whether Ethan would consider staying at the cabin for a time, watching over it, keeping it from falling entirely into ruin. He explained that the cabin sat on land where few people passed, a peaceful place where a man could breathe away from the weight of others. Ethan felt the request settle in his mind like a stone sinking into water. For a moment, he did not speak. His life had been drifting without direction. He had slept in his pickup far more nights than he wished to admit. He had carried his belongings in crates and bags that fit into narrow spaces. He had no real home, only temporary anchors. The idea of living in a cabin, even one old and worn, was unexpectedly stirring. He looked at Henry again and understood that this was not simply a request for help. It was an offering. Henry was entrusting him with something of personal value, something connected to years of memory and work. That level of trust from a man he had only just met weighed deeper than Ethan expected. Ethan asked what condition the cabin was in. Henry described it truthfully. The roof needed patching. The door frame leaned slightly. The interior was dusty but intact. The land around it was quiet, with tall trees offering shade and a small clearing nearby where sunlight fell in soft golden patches during the afternoon. Henry said he had tried to keep it maintained, but age had slowed his efforts until he could no longer manage. Duke lifted his head at that moment and tilted it slightly, his amber eyes bright with interest. Ethan found the dog's reaction almost amusing. Duke seemed to sense the possibility of a new chapter before Ethan himself had processed it fully. Ethan reached down and rubbed the top of Duke's head. The dog leaned into his hand with unmistakable enthusiasm. Henry noticed the exchange and let out a gentle breath that might have been a laugh. He added that he believed Duke would enjoy the open space around the cabin. Ethan considered the words carefully. He imagined the quiet wind moving through the tall grass. He imagined waking to the sound of birds and shaping a life with simpler rhythms. He imagined a place where his mind might loosen from the weight it had carried for too long. The thought was almost too hopeful to trust. Yet he also knew he had nowhere else to go. The forest had offered him calm when he arrived, and Henry now offered him shelter. Accepting felt less like a choice and more like following a path that had quietly been waiting. Ethan nodded after a long pause. He told Henry he would stay at the cabin and watch over it. The relief in Henry's expression was immediate. He looked down at his wrapped arm, and then back at Ethan with gratitude that needed no further explanation. The nurse entered briefly to check Henry's condition. She was a simple presence with kind eyes and a gentle approach, but she remained a background figure. Ethan stood to leave, knowing Henry needed rest. Duke rose and walked beside him with steady steps. As Ethan stepped outside the clinic, the air felt different. The sunlight seemed warmer. The wind carried a note of direction rather than emptiness. Duke trotted ahead with a bright energy, as if sensing the beginning of something important. Ethan felt a quiet shift inside him. He had come into the forest, searching for distance from life. Instead, life had reached toward him through the hand of an old carpenter with a broken arm and a worn memory of a cabin in the woods. And now, that cabin would become his shelter, at least for a time. He walked toward his pickup with Duke at his side, and for the first time in months, the road ahead did not feel like an escape. It felt like the beginning of a place he might belong. The afternoon sun hung gently above the treetops, and warm light filtered through the branches in soft golden ribbons. The forest air carried the mild scent of dry leaves mixed with distant pine, and a quiet calm rested over the cabin clearing. A faint breeze moved slowly across the worn porch and brushed the dust that had settled on the steps over the years. It was a peaceful day that seemed to hold its breath as Ethan Brooks and Duke continued the slow work of bringing life back to the old wooden home. The cabin stood with the worn dignity of something that had once been cared for deeply. Its boards were weathered and gray. The roof sagged in places. The windows were smudged with time. Yet the structure held a quiet charm that reminded Ethan of things built with intention rather than speed. As he stepped inside, he could almost sense the memory of Henry Lawson moving through these rooms years earlier, shaping the walls with tools and patient hands. Ethan began clearing debris from the floor, gathering old rags and fallen leaves that had blown in through gaps in the wood. The interior felt still and hollow, but not unfriendly. He imagined how it must have looked long ago, before age and weather had claimed it. Duke padded behind him with curious steps, his ears shifting with every small sound. His strong body and calm posture added a sense of companionship that softened the heaviness inside Ethan. Ethan bent down to lift a broken wooden crate and heard a soft scraping noise behind him. When he turned, he saw Duke pawing firmly at a narrow section of the floor near the far wall. The dog worked with focused determination, as if he had found something buried and important. Ethan straightened his back and approached slowly. Duke continued scraping until his paw revealed the edge of a loose floorboard slightly darker than the others. Ethan crouched and pried the board up. Beneath it lay a shallow hollow space. Inside rested a small wooden box, old and darkened from age. Its edges were softened by time, and the grain carried marks that suggested it had been opened and closed many times long ago. Ethan felt a quiet tension in his chest as he lifted it carefully into the sunlight. The box felt strangely significant. Duke sat beside him with alert eyes, as if understanding the importance of the moment. Ethan opened the lid slowly. Inside lay several sheets of brittle paper rolled tightly and tied with a faded strip of cloth. He gently unwrapped them and spread them across the floor. The papers were hand-drawn maps. The ink had softened, but the lines remained clear. They showed boundaries of land surrounding the cabin, marked with careful detail. Ethan read the notations and realized they had been created by an ancestor of Henry Lawson, likely a man who surveyed land before the cabin had even existed. The maps indicated that the forest around the cabin fell under old ecological protection guidelines, meaning no commercial activity was permitted here. The lines showed clear markings that designated the land as a conservation area from decades earlier when natural habitats were carefully recorded. Ethan stared at the maps. A sense of responsibility rose in him. These documents were not simple drawings. They were proof of something much larger. Proof that the land was meant to remain untouched. Proof that the forest around Henry's cabin carried a protected status that many modern developers might not know about. A faint unease touched Ethan. Duke shifted beside him, as if mirroring his inner tension. Something told Ethan these maps had been hidden for a reason. Perhaps Henry's ancestors protected them, because the forest had always been vulnerable to those who saw it only as profit. Ethan rolled the maps back up with care and placed them on the table. He felt Duke nudge his elbow softly. The dog was calm but alert, as though urging him to remain focused. Ethan knew he would need to show the documents to Henry. The cabin that had been offered to him was not only a shelter, it was now tied to a history of stewardship, a history that might become important again. A sharp sound outside broke the quiet. Duke lifted his head and released a low growl. Ethan stepped outside the cabin into the clearing. The air was warm, and a thin cloud of dust drifted where tires had rolled across the dry soil. A dark, polished truck approached the edge of the clearing and came to a stop. Ethan felt Duke step forward with a protective stance. Two men climbed out. They were dressed in clean work boots and pressed shirts that looked out of place in the forest. The taller one was in his late 30s, with neatly trimmed dark hair and a clean-shaven jaw. His build was lean but confident, and his posture carried a subtle sharpness. His eyes were a narrow blue that seemed to measure everything for usefulness. His companion was younger, with sandy hair and a more casual posture. He carried a clipboard and avoided eye contact. The taller man stepped forward with a smile that never reached his eyes. His voice held a practiced friendliness that felt cold underneath. He introduced himself in a plain manner as a representative of a lumber development company. His tone suggested someone used to negotiating land deals and winning them with charm and pressure. His appearance was polished, as though he had spent years working in offices rather than outdoors. Yet there was a hardness in his expression that betrayed ambition more than genuine interest. He explained that the company planned to purchase stretches of forest in the area for a new project. He spoke of opportunity, jobs, and progress. He mentioned that Henry Lawson owned some of the land and that they hoped to acquire it quickly. He asked Ethan whether Henry might be willing to sell. Ethan listened carefully. A quiet ridge of suspicion rose in him. He looked toward the forest around the cabin, then back at the man. Something about the company's timing felt too convenient, too sudden, as though they had been watching the land closely, waiting for a chance to move in. Duke stood tense at Ethan's side. His stance remained steady, but his muscles shifted with cautious awareness. Ethan placed a hand on Duke's back in a subtle gesture of reassurance, though the gesture also reassured himself. Ethan replied calmly. He stated he was only watching over the cabin for Henry, and that any decisions about land ownership rested solely with Henry. The tall man nodded, but Ethan noticed the impatience in his eyes. The younger man behind him scribbled something on the clipboard without speaking. Their presence carried an unsettling weight, as if they had come to claim something rather than discuss it. The tall man looked around the clearing with a calculating gaze. It was a look that made Ethan's chest tighten. Ethan remembered the maps inside the cabin. He remembered the designated conservation markings and the history tied to the land. He sensed that if the company discovered the maps, they would attempt to discredit them or exploit them for their own purpose. The man thanked Ethan for his time, then returned to the truck. As the vehicle drove away, a cloud of dust rose behind it. Ethan followed it with his eyes until the road turned and silence returned to the forest. He stood there for a long moment. Duke pressed against his leg with a soft huff. Ethan rested his hand on the dog's shoulder and felt the steady strength beneath the fur. He understood that something important was beginning. The maps were no longer only pieces of history. They were protection. But they could also become targets. Ethan returned inside the cabin and unrolled the maps once more. He studied them with new understanding. They proved the land was meant to remain untouched. And now, a company with unclear intentions wanted to claim that same land for development. He knew instinctively that Henry would need to see these documents. He also knew that he could not allow the forest to be stripped for profit. A quiet firmness settled in him. Not the rushed determination of panic, but the steady resolve of someone who had once learned to protect what mattered. He folded the maps carefully and set them aside. Duke watched him calmly, yet with expectation. Ethan looked back at the dog and spoke in a tone that carried certainty even without special symbols. He would help Henry uncover the truth. He would not allow this forest to be taken without a fight. And so the quiet cabin at the heart of the woods became the beginning of a promise. The late afternoon sunlight filtered gently through layers of green leaves as a mild breeze carried the earthy scent of soil and fresh grass across the forest floor. The temperature was warm enough to soften the edges of the day, but cool enough to keep the air comfortable. It was the kind of weather that made the forest seem alive and welcoming, though it still hid its dangers beneath calm surfaces. Ethan Brooks walked steadily beside Duke as the two moved deeper into the trees to inspect the outer boundary of the land Henry had entrusted to him. Ethan felt more grounded than he had in months, yet the weight of responsibility sat quietly in the back of his mind. He carried the old maps in his pack, and every step he took reminded him that the forest now depended on him in ways he had never planned for. Duke trotted ahead with focused curiosity. His strong body moved with confidence and alertness, ears flicking in rhythm with each new sound. Ethan admired the calm determination in the dog. Duke had saved a life before, and Ethan knew the dog carried instincts sharpened by loyalty more than training. The path narrowed where roots twisted across the soil. Ethan stepped carefully, scanning the ground as he compared the surrounding landscape to the markings he remembered on the maps. He wanted to confirm that the boundaries had not shifted and that no company workers had disturbed anything. As he moved around a fallen log, his boot suddenly slid on loose dirt. The ground beneath him crumbled away faster than he could react. His body dropped downward, and he fell into a hidden depression in the earth. The fall was not far, but the impact sent a sharp pain through his shoulder. He landed on his side in a hole about 6 feet deep, surrounded by packed dirt and tangled roots. The ache in his shoulder spread quickly, and he felt the joint resisting his attempt to move. Pain pulsed with each breath. Duke barked sharply from above, pacing at the edge of the hole. Ethan pushed himself up halfway, but winced as his injured shoulder refused to cooperate. His voice trembled with frustration as he called out to Duke, telling him to stay calm. But before Ethan could attempt another move, Duke suddenly turned and sprinted away into the trees. Ethan felt a wave of fear rise in his chest. The forest had grown quiet except for the distant sound of Duke crashing through underbrush. Ethan clenched his jaw. He knew Duke would never abandon him, but worry gnawed at him as minutes passed. He tried to climb, using his good arm, gripping exposed roots with strained fingers, but the dirt slid each time he pushed upward. The walls of the hole were too loose to support his weight. Sweat gathered at his brow. His breath grew unsteady. Despite everything he had endured in the military long ago, moments like this brought back the uneasy sense of vulnerability he thought he had left behind. He forced himself to stay calm, though a knot tightened in his chest. After several long minutes, he heard fast approaching footsteps. Duke appeared first, tail stiff and posture urgent. Behind him came a young woman in a forest green uniform. She moved with quick precision, her boots leaving sure prints on the forest floor. She had light brown hair tied back in a low braid. Her face held a gentle strength, with warm tan skin and attentive eyes the color of deep moss. Her expression suggested a calm confidence shaped by long days in the wild and a genuine care for the land she protected. She introduced herself as Claire Bennett, a forest ranger assigned to patrol the area. She spoke with a steady tone and a hint of concern. As she knelt at the edge of the hole, she assessed Ethan with a practiced eye. Claire appeared to be in her late 20s. Her posture showed discipline, but her voice carried a softness that put people at ease. She had the kind of presence that combined both resilience and empathy. Claire secured a wide strap around a nearby tree to create leverage, then lowered a rope down to Ethan. She instructed him to loop it around his chest and use only his uninjured arm to hold steady. Duke stood beside her, watching every movement with intense focus. Together they pulled, Claire bracing her legs and leaning her weight backward as Ethan ascended slowly along the dirt wall. The climb was difficult. Pain shot through his shoulder each time the rope tightened, but Claire kept her movements smooth and controlled. When Ethan finally reached the top and collapsed onto solid ground, Duke pressed his head to Ethan's chest with a trembling sigh of relief. Ethan breathed heavily, grateful for the stability of the earth beneath him. Claire inspected his shoulder with careful hands. Her touch was firm but gentle. She determined it was likely a strong sprain rather than a full dislocation, though she urged him to visit a clinic soon to prevent worse damage. Ethan nodded, aware of how close he had been to a dangerous situation. As Claire listened to the story of how Duke had run for help, her eyes softened. She looked at the dog with admiration. Duke sat proudly, his tongue slightly out, chest rising with calm breaths. Ethan felt a swell of gratitude. Duke had acted with clear purpose. The dog had made the difference between being trapped and being rescued. Claire explained that she had found Duke on the main trail, barking urgently and running back and forth until she followed him. She added that Duke showed a level of intelligence and loyalty she rarely saw. Ethan felt a quiet pride grow inside him. Claire then asked about the maps Ethan carried and the company that had visited him. After hearing his account, her expression grew serious. She explained that if the land truly fell under conservation status, he and Henry would need legal guidance to challenge any attempt to develop it. Though she was not a lawyer, She had training in land protection policy and offered to help them find the proper channels. Her commitment came not from obligation, but from a sense of justice and respect for the forest. Ethan felt something shift inside him, a mixture of relief and renewed determination. Help had arrived in a form he had not expected. Claire represented not only support, but also a voice of authority that could make a difference. As Claire walked back with them toward the cabin, Ethan looked at Duke with a quiet smile. The dog returned his gaze with steady amber eyes that carried understanding. Duke had saved him again, not through strength, but through instinct and loyalty. Ethan knew he owed Duke more than gratitude. He owed him the promise of continuing forward. The sun dipped lower through the branches as the three of them moved through the forest. Ethan felt the sharp pain in his shoulder, but it was eased by the knowledge that he was no longer facing this fight alone. Duke had brought help, and now Claire was part of the path ahead. The evening settled over the forest, with warm air drifting slowly between the tall trees. The sky carried a muted orange glow as clouds thinned across the horizon. A light breeze stirred the leaves, but the weather remained calm and steady, giving no sign of what was about to happen. Ethan Brooks walked back toward the cabin with Duke at his side. His shoulder was still sore from the earlier injury, but he moved with caution and determination. He was thinking about the maps he had found under the floorboards and the conversations he had shared with Claire. Her guidance gave him hope that protecting the land might truly be possible. Duke walked alertly, his strong frame moving with quiet confidence. The dog had been restless since late afternoon, sniffing the air in unusual patterns. Ethan noticed, but assumed it was simply the scent of other animals moving through the evening forest. When they reached the clearing around the cabin, Ethan paused. Something felt different. The fading sunlight touched the wooden walls and cast long shadows, yet the air held a faint tension that set his nerves on edge. He took a step closer. Duke suddenly stiffened, ears pushing forward. The dog lifted his nose sharply toward the direction of Henry's old supply shed at the far end of the property. The shed was small and weathered, built long ago with rough planks and a sagging roof. Henry used it to store old tools, wood scraps, and personal boxes he had not opened in years. Ethan moved forward and saw a flicker of unnatural light near the shed. Duke let out a low, warning growl. Ethan felt his breath shorten. As he approached, he noticed the unmistakable scent of gasoline floating in the air. Duke stepped ahead and began barking with sharp urgency. Ethan broke into a run, ignoring the pain in his shoulder. Bright orange flames licked the lower corner of the shed. Smoke rose quickly, catching the dry wood. Ethan felt his stomach twist. Someone had set this fire. There was no doubt. He looked around the clearing, scanning for movement, but only shadows shifted on the ground. Duke barked louder and sprinted toward the shed door. Ethan followed him in panic. Before he reached the door, he heard a voice from inside. It was faint, strained, almost drowned by the growing crackle of flames. Ethan recognized it instantly. Henry. The realization struck him hard. Henry Lawson had come earlier to pick up some old belongings. Ethan had not expected him to return at dusk. He grabbed the shed door, but heat pulsed through the wood. The fire had grown faster than he could have imagined. Ethan pulled his shirt over his hand and yanked again. The door gave way slightly, then stuck. Duke barked fiercely, as if urging Ethan not to give up. Ethan stepped back. kicked the lower part of the door with all the strength he could gather. The weakened wood splintered enough for him to pull it open. Smoke burst outward in a suffocating wave. Inside, Henry was collapsed near the back wall, a thin man in his late 60s, with gray hair and deeply lined features. His face was pale under the soot. He was trembling from smoke inhalation. Henry had the build of someone who had worked with his hands all his life, his shoulders slightly hunched, his clothes worn with years of labor. Ethan rushed in and grabbed him under the arms, ignoring the pain in his shoulder as fire popped dangerously close. Duke ran inside with them, circling anxiously. Heat scorched the edges of the room. Ethan pulled Henry toward the open door. Henry struggled to breathe, but managed to whisper a hoarse sound. His eyes showed both fear and relief as he recognized Ethan. Step by step, Ethan dragged him out into clearer air. They collapsed together, just beyond the flame line. Duke stood guard at Henry's side, barking toward the burning structure. Ethan coughed hard as smoke clung to his lungs. He turned toward the cabin and saw movement near the tree line. For a moment he thought he had caught someone watching them, but the figure was gone before he could identify anything. His heart pounded. He knew this was no accident. Whoever wanted the land had decided to destroy anything that could protect it. As the fire grew brighter, footsteps approached from the trail. Claire Bennett emerged through the trees, her uniform slightly dusty from her long day of patrol. Her face held a mixture of alarm and focus. She ran toward them with quick, steady strides. When she reached the clearing and saw the shed fully burning, her expression sharpened. She knelt beside Henry and checked his breathing. Claire then looked at the gasoline stains near the shed, and her jaw tightened. She pulled a small camera device from her hip pouch and began documenting every angle. Claire had a calm but firm presence when facing emergencies. Her moss-green eyes narrowed as she surveyed the scene. She spoke in a steady tone, explaining that she would report this immediately. She captured footprints near the side of the shed, broken plants, and the burn pattern along the wood. She worked with precision, her movements efficient and confident. Ethan watched her, grateful for her experience and her sense of justice. Duke remained close to Henry, nudging the older man's arm gently, as if reminding him to stay awake. Henry slowly regained more strength. He described how he had entered the shed and noticed a strange chemical smell before someone pushed the door shut. He had not seen who it was. Claire listened carefully and took notes. Ethan clenched his fists. Anger simmered inside him, mixed with fear for what might come next. Claire contacted local law enforcement through her radio. Her voice remained calm as she explained the situation and requested an investigative team. Ethan saw the determination in her eyes. She believed him. She believed Henry. And she understood the danger. As the fire consumed the last beams of the shed, Ethan felt exhaustion wash over him. But he also felt resolve strengthening. The attack was meant to scare them, to destroy evidence, to break their spirit. Instead, it pushed them closer together. Duke sat beside him, breathing steadily, eyes bright with awareness. Ethan placed a hand on the dog's strong back. Duke had sensed the danger first. Duke had saved Henry's life. And now, the fight to protect the forest had become even more urgent. The night grew darker as the flames dimmed to embers. Claire stood with Ethan and Henry, promising to stay involved until the truth was uncovered. Ethan felt gratitude for her presence and for the loyal dog beside him. The forest around them was quiet again, but Ethan knew things had changed. The threat was real now, yet so was their resolve. Morning light drifted across the forest in soft golden layers. The weather was clear and warm, and the gentle movement of branches carried the ease of a peaceful day. Sunlight touched the tops of the trees and spilled across the ground like a promise that something long awaited had finally arrived. Ethan Brooks stood outside the damaged cabin with Duke at his side. His shoulders still throbbed from the recent fall, and the memory of the fire lingered sharply in his mind. Yet for the first time in weeks, he felt a shift in the air, a sense that the struggle might finally be turning in their favor. Claire had contacted the county office early that morning. Her calm voice carried through the phone as she explained that an official team would arrive soon to verify the ancient boundary maps and the conservation markers. Ethan listened quietly, heart pounding with cautious hope. Duke paced near his feet, occasionally lifting his head toward the dirt path that led to the main road. The dog sensed something different in the mood of the day. His ears twitched with alert curiosity, and his strong body held a readiness that mirrored Ethan's own anticipation. By mid-morning, 2 county inspectors arrived. They were simple working men wearing khaki uniforms. One was younger, tall and lean with sandy blonde hair and light skin that burned easily in the sun. The other was older, broad-shouldered, with a gray beard and dark brown eyes that carried years of field experience. Their names were Thomas Green and Walter Briggs. Both had steady professional voices and a respectful manner as they shook hands with Ethan and Claire. Ethan answered their questions carefully, aware of the seriousness of their task. The inspectors examined the wooden box Duke had uncovered. Inside lay the preserved survey documents from generations before Henry. The papers were yellowed, fragile at the edges, but the ink remained clear. Hand-drawn lines marked the boundaries of the forest, and the signatures revealed that the land was designated as protected territory by early conservation authorities. Thomas photographed the maps and compared them to modern satellite overlays. Walter took notes with slow, precise handwriting. His voice was thoughtful as he explained that the documents aligned with several historic orders that had never been overturned. After an hour of reviewing everything, the older inspector closed his notebook and looked at Ethan with a decisive expression. He stated that the land was indeed part of a conservation zone. No logging company had legal right to touch it. Claire exhaled in relief. Ethan felt tension melt from his shoulders. Duke let out a single strong bark as if he understood the significance. When the inspectors returned to their vehicle, Claire remained with Ethan. Her eyes reflected both satisfaction and a quiet pride. She told him that the county would issue a formal suspension against the logging operation. Their attempt to pressure landowners or destroy evidence would now be investigated further. Justice was unfolding in measured steps, but it was real. Later that day, Henry Lawson arrived. He walked slowly, but with more strength than he had shown since the fire. His thin frame was wrapped in a light jacket, and the deep lines on his face carried exhaustion mixed with gratitude. His gray hair was combed neatly, though soot had stained the ends days before. Henry looked at the burned foundation of his old shed, then at the cabin behind Ethan. His eyes softened with emotion. Henry spoke in a quiet voice that trembled at the edges. He explained that he had lived many years believing he had little left to give to anyone. Time had worn him down, and memories of his family had faded like old photographs. But Ethan had saved him twice, once by chance on the roadside, and once by risking his life during the fire. Henry stepped closer. He told Ethan that the cabin no longer belonged to him. He wanted Ethan and Duke to have it. His words were firm but gentle, carrying the weight of a man who had thought deeply before speaking. Ethan felt his chest tighten. Gratitude mixed with disbelief. The cabin represented more than shelter. It was a chance at stability, a place to rebuild both physically and emotionally. Duke nudged Ethan's hand, as if urging him to accept. Ethan thanked Henry with a steady voice that masked the intensity of his emotions. As news traveled across the small town, everything changed faster than Ethan expected. People from Birchwood, a community known for its hardworking families, began arriving at the forest clearing. Some were carpenters, some were farmers, and others were shopkeepers with kind eyes and calloused hands. They carried wood planks, nails, paint cans, and baskets of food. Each person said they had heard what Ethan had done for Henry and how he had stood against the logging company. A tall man named Russell came first. He was a carpenter with short black hair and a stocky build. His dark skin held the warm tone of someone who spent long hours outdoors. He had a friendly yet reserved manner. He told Ethan that he would repair the cabin walls. Then came Marlene, owner of the town bakery. She was a middle-aged woman with curly brown hair, soft round features, and a bright smile that revealed her naturally caring spirit. She brought fresh bread and jars of jam. Others followed until the yard filled with conversation and the sound of tools. Ethan stood among them, absorbing the kindness that filled the clearing. For a man who had spent years feeling detached from the world, this sudden connection felt overwhelming. He felt something stir in his chest, something warm and unfamiliar. It was the feeling of belonging. Duke stayed near Ethan, guiding people around the cabin with gentle nudges. Children knelt to pet the dog, and Duke accepted their attention with calm patience. At one point, Henry sat on a tree stump watching the activity. His weathered face carried a deep sense of peace. Sunlight touched the clearing as boards were cut, windows repaired, and walls strengthened. The cabin began to change shape, not just physically, but spiritually. It was becoming a home. As the day came to an end, Ethan stood at the door of the renewed structure. The smell of fresh wood mixed with the scent of warm earth. People waved goodbye as they returned to town. Claire paused before leaving and told Ethan that this was only the beginning. He nodded with quiet certainty. Duke sat beside him, tail sweeping slowly through the dust. Ethan looked at the forest that had once felt like a temporary refuge. Now it felt like a place that chose him back. And as the sun dipped and the clearing grew quiet again, Ethan understood that the fight had been worth it. Justice had found its way through the trees, and a future, once uncertain, was opening before him. The dry season arrived gently across the forest as warm golden sunlight filtered through tall branches each morning. The air carried the scent of dust and sun-warmed bark, and the sky stretched wide and blue without a single sign of rain. Breezes moved softly through the clearing around the cabin, bringing a quiet sense of peace that felt deserved after months of unrest. Ethan Brooks stepped onto the porch in the early hours, stretching his shoulder carefully. The pain had faded to a mild reminder, no longer sharp, only a faint echo of all he had endured. The cabin behind him stood solid and renewed, shaped by the hands of townspeople who had cared enough to help. Its wooden walls were sturdy again, the roof patched, the windows shining with freshly cleaned glass. For Ethan, it no longer felt like a temporary shelter. It felt like a home. Duke walked beside him with slow, confident steps. The German shepherd's coat glowed under the sunlight, a mix of deep browns and warm golds, and his strong frame carried an air of calm authority. Word had spread quickly through Birchwood that Duke was a hero. Children called him the rescue dog of the ridge, and adults greeted him with soft smiles and gentle pats. Ethan took pride in that, though Duke seemed content simply to stay close to him. The forest around them had grown familiar in a comforting way. Birds called in the morning, their voices rising and falling in gentle patterns. Leaves drifted in small spirals whenever the breeze passed. Ethan felt each sound settle into him like pieces of a life he never expected to reclaim. He had become the caretaker of the conservation land. Claire helped him through the process of getting approved. The job was simple but meaningful. Ethan monitored trails, checked boundary markers, and guided visitors through safe paths. Schools often arranged field days where children could learn about nature and fire prevention. He also taught hikers how to prepare for emergencies with steady practical lessons drawn from his years in the military. For Ethan, sharing these skills brought a sense of purpose he had not felt since leaving the service. One morning, a group of children arrived, accompanied by a teacher named Laura Hayes. She was a woman in her 40s, with soft brown hair tied loosely at the back and gentle features shaped by years of kindness in the classroom. Her light skin carried faint freckles across her cheeks, and her voice held a calm, encouraging tone. She thanked Ethan for hosting the lesson, and the children gathered eagerly around him. Ethan demonstrated how to identify safe shelter spots during storms. He explained how to read wind direction and how to build a simple emergency signal with sticks and cloth. The children listened with wide eyes, and Duke calmly walked among them, allowing small hands to brush against his thick fur. Some children asked questions about Duke and his rescues. Ethan spoke about the dog's instincts, loyalty, and courage. The admiration on their faces filled Ethan with quiet pride. As the day moved forward, Ethan guided the group along a short trail. Sunlight flickered through the branches overhead and created shifting patterns on the ground. The breeze carried laughter and footsteps, sounds Ethan once thought would never belong in his life again. When the children departed, Ethan watched Duke trot after them for a few steps, tail lifted with gentle happiness. The teacher thanked Ethan again, praising his patience and clarity. Ethan replied with a modest smile. He did not seek praise, but hearing it warmed him deeply. As the weeks passed, tourists and hikers began to visit more often. The county had added small signs marking the area as a protected zone. Claire stopped by regularly to check on progress, sometimes with maps in hand, sometimes simply to talk. She remained steady and observant. Her presence brought calm without effort. Ethan appreciated her company more than he admitted aloud. Duke had earned an official ribbon from the ranger office marking him as an honorary rescue dog. It was a small symbol, but people treated it with respect. Whenever Duke walked into town beside Ethan, shop owners greeted him with friendly waves. Children ran to meet him. The dog accepted each gesture with patient dignity. Ethan noticed that Duke had grown more confident. He no longer carried the same tension he once did during long drives or quiet nights. Instead, He walked with a sense of purpose, as if he knew his place in this new life. One evening, after a long, warm day of clearing fallen branches from a trail, Ethan returned to the cabin with Duke at his side. The sun was dipping lower behind the trees, casting deep amber rays across the clearing. Shadows stretched across the porch in soft lines. Ethan settled into a wooden chair he had repaired himself. Duke lay beside him on the smooth boards, his breathing steady and relaxed. The forest glowed with late afternoon light. Birds quieted their songs as cricket sounds began to rise. Ethan rested his arms on his knees and looked out at the trees. A sense of peace moved through him, unlike anything he had felt in years. He thought about the path that had brought him here, the months of struggle, the danger, the fear that he might never find solid ground again. And yet, each moment had guided him forward. He remembered the day Duke howled on the roadside and led him to Henry. That single action had changed everything. It had drawn Ethan into a chain of events that rebuilt him from the inside out. He looked down at Duke, who opened his eyes briefly and let out a soft rumble of contentment. Ethan felt an ache of gratitude in his chest. For years he believed he was drifting downward, slipping quietly from the world. But here, in the calm breath of the forest, he understood something he had been too tired to see before. Life had not abandoned him. It had simply waited for him to take the next step. He reached down and rested his hand on Duke's back. The dog pressed closer, eyes half closed. The light filtered through the branches in slow, gentle beams. Ethan watched it and let himself feel the fullness of the moment. The cabin was no longer a temporary refuge. It was a home. The forest was no longer a place to hide. It was a purpose. Ethan had become a man who taught others how to stay safe. A man who protected the land. A man who had found his direction again thanks to a loyal dog who refused to let him fall. As the sun dipped behind the ridge, Ethan spoke quietly to Duke. We made it home. Duke's tail tapped softly on the porch. Peace embraced them as evening settled, and for the first time in a long time, Ethan felt ready for whatever tomorrow might bring. In the quiet rhythm of the forest, this story reaches its end, yet its message continues to grow. Ethan found purpose again, not through sudden fortune, but through simple acts of courage, kindness, and community. Duke, with loyal heart and tireless spirit, reminded him that hope often returns in the form of companionship and small daily miracles. The people around them proved that a town can rise together when one person chooses to stand for what is right. In this gentle rise from hardship to healing, we see the way grace often works, like sunlight through the trees, steady, warm, and guiding. As you carry this story into your own days, may you see God's quiet miracles in the moments that lift your spirit. If this journey touched you, please share it so others may find hope. Leave a comment, join our growing family by subscribing, and may God bless you with peace, strength, and renewal in every season ahead.